Proud billionaire slapped pregnant doctor and walked away laughing. He had no idea who her brother was. I don't care if she's in surgery. I donated 12 million to this wing, and I want this floor cleared now. You're just a girl in a white coat playing God. Victor Langford's voice didn't just carry, it curdled the air of the intensive care unit, shattering the fragile sanctuary of hissing ventilators and rhythmic heart monitors. He stood there in a hand-tailored suit that cost more than the average nurse earned in a year, his face twisted into a mask of supreme, unchecked arrogance. Amara Bennett didn't move. She stood her ground, her lab coat stretched tight over the 7-month curve of her pregnancy. Her lower back was a dull roar of agony, a grinding ache that had started hours ago, but she remained an immovable pillar of professional resolve. That may be your right, Mr. Langford, she replied, her voice a cool scalpel cutting through his histrionics. But you're still not crossing this threshold while my patient is on that table. In this room, wealth doesn't dictate the order of survival. Medicine does. The silence that followed was heavy, ionized with a tension that made the hair on the nearby nurse's arm stand up. Lean Morales, standing by the nurse's station, went perfectly still, her hand hovering over a chart. She had seen Victor Langford's temper before, but never directed at someone who refused to flinch. Victor's eyes darkened, a predatory glint replacing his initial shock. He took a step forward, invading Amara's personal space until he could smell the faint scent of the expensive espresso on his breath mixed with the hospital's pervasive lavender antiseptic. You think your little pregnancy makes you untouchable, he hissed, his voice dropping to a low, vibrating growl. You think that badge gives you the right to talk down to me? Before Amara could draw her next breath to respond, Victor's hand blurred. The sound of the slap was a violent crack, echoing off the linoleum floors and glass partitions like a gunshot. Amara's head snapped to the side, her glasses skidding across the floor. She stumbled, her hand instinctively flying to her belly to protect the life kicking frantically inside her. Victor didn't look horrified. He threw his head back and laughed. A jagged, ugly sound that felt like a violation of the ward's hushed sanctity. Look at you, he mocked, walking away toward the elevators while adjusting his cufflinks. A peasant trying to hold back the tide. Amara. Lean rushed forward, but she was shoved aside by Dr. Malcolm Pierce. The hospital director didn't look at the red mark blooming on Amara's cheek or the way she was trembling. He looked only at the retreating back of his most significant donor. Bennett, what have you done? Pierce's voice was high-pitched with panic. He turned to her, his eyes cold and transactional. He assaulted a physician, Malcolm, Amara whispered, her voice thick with a mix of shock and rising fury. He put a patient and an unborn child at risk. No, Pierce snapped, his loyalty already bought and paid for. You insulted a benefactor. You jeopardized the future of this entire facility over a moment of ego. I can't have a liability like you on my staff, especially not in your delicate condition. He reached out, his fingers trembling as he snatched the stethoscope from around her neck. Hand over your badge. You're fired, effective immediately. Security will escort you to your locker and then to the exit. Don't bother looking for a reference, you'll be lucky if you ever practice medicine in this hemisphere again. Amara stood frozen as Pierce scurried away to grovel at Victor's feet near the elevator bank. She looked at Lean, who had tears in her eyes, and then at the closed door of the ICU where a man's life hung in the balance, a life Victor Langford considered a mere inconvenience. Amara felt the stinging heat on her face, but deeper than that, she felt a cold, familiar iron settling in her veins. She had spent years trying to be the Ice Queen, the self-made surgeon who didn't need the shadow of her family name to survive. She had wanted to be Amara the doctor, not Amara the Bennett. But as she felt the weight of her termination and the mocking echo of Victor's laughter, she realized that the normal life she had built was a house of cards that a billionaire had just blown over for sport. She reached into her pocket, her fingers brushing against a secondary phone she hadn't turned on in 3 years. Victor Langford thought he had just broken a nurse. He had no idea he had just awakened a ghost. Under the flickering fluorescent lights, Amara Bennett took a slow, painful breath for two, and for the first time in her career, she stopped thinking like a doctor and started thinking like a Bennett. Let's take a pause. Kindly subscribe to my channel and tell me in the comments section where you are listening from. Thank you. Let's continue. The sterile, recycled air of the hospital was replaced by the biting dampness of a city that didn't care for heroes. Amara Bennett walked through the sliding glass doors of Riverdale Medical Center for the last time, her fingers still numb where she had clutched her medical license. The mark on her cheek had transitioned from a sharp heat to a dull, throbbing ache that pulsed in sync with her heartbeat. Every few steps, she had to stop to catch her breath, the weight of her 7-month pregnancy making the simple act of walking to the parking garage feel like an uphill marathon. She reached her car. A sensible sedan that represented years of double shifts and saved bonuses, and fumbled for her keys. As she sat in the driver's seat, the silence of the cabin felt like a heavy shroud. She reached for her phone to call her landlord, needing the comfort of her own four walls to process the systematic destruction of her career. But when she tapped the screen, a red notification banner sat at the top, service suspended. A cold trickle of dread, sharper than the rain hitting the windshield, settled in her chest. She drove toward her apartment in a daze, her mind replaying Victor Langford's jagged laugh. When she pulled up to the curb of her building, she found two men in dark suits standing under the awning. Beside them sat a neat pile of cardboard boxes. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she recognized the floral pattern of her own duvet peeking out from a half-taped carton. "Dr. Bennett?" The taller man asked, his voice devoid of empathy. "This property has been reclaimed under a priority lien. Your lease was terminated 60 minutes ago for a breach of the morality clause in your contract." "Morality clause?" Amara's voice cracked. "I was assaulted. I was protecting a patient." "We just follow the paperwork, ma'am," he replied, handing her a single legal envelope. "Your personal effects have been moved to the sidewalk. The locks have already been changed." She stood on the pavement, the first heavy drops of a late afternoon storm soaking through her thin blouse. She reached into her purse for her wallet, intending to find a hotel, any place to sit down before her legs gave out. She pulled out her debit card and walked to the ATM at the corner bodega. She punched in her code with shaking fingers, praying for enough to cover a week at a roadside motel. The screen didn't show her balance. Instead, a flickering message appeared, "Account restricted. Contact your financial institution." Victor Langford hadn't just slapped her, he was erasing her. With a few phone calls and the casual flick of his billionaire status, he had turned a brilliant trauma surgeon into a ghost. Amara stood in the intensifying rain, her hair plastered to her forehead, staring at the boxes that contained the fragments of her life. She was a woman who saved lives every day, a woman who understood the intricate mechanics of the human heart, yet she was powerless against the mechanical cruelty of a man with too much money. She looked down at her swollen belly, feeling the protective surge of a mother who had nothing left but her resolve. The rain was cold, but the fire starting to burn in her gut was colder. Victor Langford wanted to see her crawl. He wanted her to disappear into the gutters of the city he claimed to own. Slowly, Amara reached into the hidden lining of her purse. She pulled out the small, encrypted burner phone she had kept for 10 years and never intended to use. She sat on the edge of a wet cardboard box, ignoring the shivers racking her frame. She dialed a number she had memorized in childhood and never dared to whisper in a hospital hallway. The line clicked open on the second ring. There was no greeting, only the heavy, expectant silence of a man who had been waiting for this call for a long time. "Raphael," she whispered, her voice finally breaking as a single tear escaped and joined the rain on her face. "It's me. I'm finished." He took everything. Across the city, the low, predatory rumble of a motorcycle engine ignited, a sound that promised the end of Victor Langford's world. The rain shifted from a relentless downpour to a pervasive, bone-chilling mist as Amara reached the designated coordinates. The intersection was a forgotten relic of the city's industrial past, where the streetlights flickered with a dying orange hum and the smell of wet asphalt was thick enough to taste. She stood by a rusted chain-link fence, her small frame shivering beneath a soaked cardigan that offered no protection against the rising wind. Every muscle in her body protested the day's trauma, but the physical pain was a distant second to the cold vacuum Victor Langford had left in the wake of her life. Then, she heard it. It wasn't a loud noise, but a low-frequency vibration that seemed to travel through the pavement and up into the soles of her shoes before it reached her ears. It was a rhythmic, mechanical pulse, the heartbeat of a predator moving through the shadows. A single headlight cut through the fog, a piercing white eye that swept over the abandoned warehouses. The silhouette of a black motorcycle materialized, its engine purring with a controlled, dangerous energy that commanded the silence of the street. The bike glided to a halt inches from where she stood. The rider was a study in stillness, a dark mountain of leather and chrome. Cairo, known to the world as Raphael Bennett, did not immediately dismount. He sat there for a moment, the heat from the engine manifold rising in shimmering waves between them. Slowly, he reached up and pulled back the visor of his helmet. His eyes, dark and unreadable, locked onto hers. He didn't ask if she was okay. He didn't ask what happened. He simply looked at the dark, swollen bruise that marred the elegant curve of her cheek, the mark left by a billionaire who thought he was untouchable. Amara saw his jaw tighten, the only outward sign of the storm brewing beneath his calm exterior. In that look, she saw decades of shared history, the childhoods they had spent surviving together, the diverging paths they had taken, and the silent pact that if the world ever broke her, he would be the one to break the world in return. With a fluid, economical motion, he reached behind him and unclipped a spare matte black helmet from the pillion seat. He didn't offer a hand or a word of comfort. He simply held the helmet out toward her. Amara reached for it, her fingers brushing against his leather gloves. The weight of the gear felt like the first solid thing she had touched since her world had collapsed in the ICU. She pulled the helmet over her head, the padded interior muffling the sounds of the weeping city and the distant sirens. As she clicked the chin strap into place, she felt a strange, terrifying sense of liberation. The Dr. Bennett, who followed protocols and believed in the inherent justice of the system, was gone, drowned in the rain on the sidewalk outside her apartment. She stepped toward the bike and climbed onto the back, her hands finding familiar purchase on the handles. She leaned her forehead against the back of his shoulder, the scent of motor oil and old leather grounding her. The motorcycle's hum intensified, a low snarl that promised a relentless, cold march toward retribution. Cairo kicked the kickstand up and engaged the gear. There were no explanations needed, no maps to consult. Victor Langford had used his influence to erase a doctor, now, the quiet man was going to use his shadow to erase a king. With a sudden, powerful surge of torque, the bike leaned into the turn, and they vanished into the darkness, leaving the empty street and the broken boxes of her former life behind. The roar of Cairo's motorcycle eventually faded into a rhythmic, low-frequency hum as they navigated the labyrinthine backstreets, moving away from the skeletal remains of the industrial district. Amara leaned into the heat of her brother's back, her mind a whirlwind of exhaustion and burgeoning hope. While the wind whipped around them, Cairo remained a silent, steady force, his movements controlled and deliberate. He didn't need to explain where they were going or how the retribution would begin. He simply acted, a predator moving with purpose. Across the city, in a skyscraper made of glass and cold ambition, Isabella Mendoza sat in a darkened office that overlooked the glittering skyline Victor Langford thought he owned. She was the scalpel to Cairo's hammer, the silent architect of digital ruin. While Victor was likely celebrating his perceived victory over a defenseless doctor, Isabella was already dismantling the foundation of his ego. Her fingers danced across a mechanical keyboard, the only sound in the room being the soft, rapid clicks of a financial assassination in progress. Victor's empire, Langford Global Tech, was built on a carefully curated image of stability and innovation. It was a house of cards held together by investor confidence and inflated projections. Isabella had spent months, long before the slap in the ICU, cataloging the structural rot within Victor's flagship firm. She had seen the call coming. She had always known Victor's arrogance would eventually lead him to the wrong target. When Cairo's silent signal reached her, she didn't hesitate. With a single keystroke, a leak originated from a supposedly secure corporate server. It wasn't just any data. It was a comprehensive ledger of offshore tax shelters, falsified R&D breakthroughs, and internal memos detailing Victor's personal use of corporate funds to blackball his enemies. The documents were delivered simultaneously to the SEC, the major financial news networks, and the board's primary institutional investors. The reaction was instantaneous and violent. In the high-frequency trading pits, the algorithm-driven sell orders triggered like a string of firecrackers. On the glowing monitors of the stock exchange, the ticker for Langford Global Tech began a vertical plunge. Within 45 minutes, 40% of Victor's personal net worth simply evaporated into the digital ether. It was a bloodless massacre. To the world, it looked like a whistleblower's sudden conscience. To Isabella, it was merely the first domino. Victor Langford was likely at a high-end gala, perhaps even the very one where a woman in a shimmering blue gown stood at the center of attention, surrounded by a crowd of sycophants. He would be holding a glass of vintage champagne, laughing about the pregnant girl in the white coat he had crushed earlier that day. But then, the vibrations would start, the frantic buzz of phones in the pockets of his board members. The laughter would die, replaced by the pale, sickly look of men realizing the ground was falling out from under them. The blue-clad woman in the ballroom stood with an elegant, almost regal posture, her eyes sharp and intelligent as she watched the chaos erupt around her. She didn't join the frantic whispering, she simply observed, her presence representing the clean, powerful world outside the streets. She understood exactly who Cairo was, and she knew that this financial hemorrhage was just the opening act. The quiet man had arrived, and his sister was ensuring that by morning, the name Langford would be synonymous with ruin. The sleek, obsidian doors of the Langford Global Tech headquarters loomed like monoliths under the midday sun, their polished surfaces reflecting a city that was already beginning to turn its back on its former king. Victor Langford marched toward the entrance, his jaw tight and his knuckles white as he gripped his leather briefcase. The financial hemorrhage of the morning, that impossible, staggering 40% loss, had left him vibrating with a toxic mixture of adrenaline and denial. He had spent the last hour screaming into 3 different phones, but now, he needed the one thing that usually restored his equilibrium, the absolute subservience of his board of directors. He reached the primary security checkpoint, his hand moving with practiced, arrogant muscle memory toward the keycard reader. He didn't even look at the guards as he prepared to sweep past the turnstiles. But when he pressed his titanium-plated executive ID against the sensor, the familiar green chirp of approval never came. Instead, the console emitted a flat, discordant crimson buzz. Victor frowned, tapping the card harder against the glass. "Check the system," he barked at the 2 guards standing like statues behind the desk. "The sensor is malfunctioning." The guards didn't move to assist him. One of them, a man whose medical bills Victor had likely indirectly paid through the company's massive insurance premiums, stepped forward. He didn't offer a polite smile or the usual deferential nod. His face was as cold as the linoleum in the ICU where Victor had stood just 24 hours ago. "I'm sorry, sir," the guard said, his voice level and entirely devoid of the fear Victor was used to inspiring. "This ID is no longer valid. You don't have clearance for this floor." Victor felt a surge of heat crawl up his neck, the same violent impulse that had led him to strike Amara Bennett. "Do you have any idea who I am? I built this building. I own the air you're breathing right now. My name is on the fountain in the plaza. Get out of my way before I have you cleaning subways by sundown." He tried to push past the barrier, but a heavy, gloved hand landed on his chest. It was a firm, immovable rejection. The second guard moved into his peripheral vision, his hand resting conspicuously near his belt. Mr. Langford, the first guard continued, the board of directors convened an emergency session 10 minutes ago. Under the newly activated ethics and liability clauses triggered by this morning's regulatory filings, your executive powers have been suspended pending a full forensic audit. You are officially barred from the premises. Victor's mouth opened, but for the first time in his life, the words didn't come. He looked around the lobby, searching for a friendly face, a sycophant, or a terrified assistant. But the staff members crossing the marble floor kept their heads down, their eyes fixed on their shoes as they scurried away from the stench of his sudden failure. He was no longer a benefactor, he was a contagion. "This is a mistake," Victor hissed, his voice cracking with the first notes of true panic. "Mendoza. Get Isabella Mendoza on the line." "Ms. Mendoza is currently chairing the emergency session, sir," the guard replied. "She gave the order to revoke your credentials personally." The realization hit Victor like a physical blow to the gut. The woman in the blue gown, the quiet, efficient shadow who had managed his digital life for years, hadn't just watched the first domino fall, she had pushed it. He was standing in the lobby of his own empire, reduced a trespasser by the very people he had treated as furniture. The predatory laughter he had unleashed in the hospital was gone, replaced by the hollow, echoing silence of a man who was realizing that when you strip away the money and the title, all that remains is the wreckage you left behind. "Escort him out," the guard said to his partner. Victor was led toward the revolving doors, his expensive heels clicking pathetically on the stone. Outside, the city noise rushed in to greet him. A chaotic, indifferent roar that didn't care about his plummeting stocks or his invalid ID. He stood on the sidewalk, a billionaire in exile, while somewhere in the distance, the low, phantom hum of a motorcycle seemed to vibrate through the very pavement beneath his feet. Standing outside the locked gates of his kingdom, Victor Langford watched the revolving doors of his headquarters turn for other people, his reflection in the glass looking increasingly like a stranger's. He didn't notice the digital shadow hovering over him, nor did he realize that while he was being physically purged from his office, the final piece of his public execution was being prepared just a few miles away. Inside the quiet confines of the Riverdale Medical Center archives, the air was thick with the scent of ozone and old paper, a stark contrast to the sterile chaos of the ICU. Lean Morales sat in the dim light of a secondary monitoring station, her face illuminated by the pale blue glow of a terminal that Dr. Pierce believed had been scrubbed clean. Pierce had been thorough in his desperation to protect the hospital's endowment. He had personally overseen the deletion of the primary cloud backups within minutes of Victor's departure. He hadn't accounted for the ghost cache. A redundant, hardwired emergency loop that Lean had discovered during a routine maintenance check months prior. Her hands trembled as she bypassed the primary administrative lockout. Lean wasn't a hacker or a corporate assassin like Isabella Mendoza, she was a nurse who had watched her friend be struck and discarded like trash. That memory, more than any fear of Pierce's retribution, drove her fingers across the keys. With a final, sharp click, the screen flickered to life. The footage was grainy, stripped of sound, but the violence was unmistakable. On the small monitor, she watched the scene play out in a silent, agonizing loop. Victor's towering silhouette, Amara's defiant stance, and then the sudden, jarring crack of his hand against her face. The camera captured the exact moment Amara's glasses spun across the floor and the way she doubled over to shield her unborn child while Victor threw his head back in that jagged, predatory laugh. It was a masterpiece of cruelty, captured in 24 frames per second. Lean didn't send the file to the board or the police. She knew how easily money could bury a police report. Instead, she uploaded the raw, unedited footage to a public encrypted leak site and tagged every major news outlet, social media influencer, and civil rights group in the tri-state area. She titled the post simply, $12 million for a slap. The digital wildfire ignited in seconds. By the time Victor reached the sidewalk and began fumbling for his phone to call a private car, the video had already surpassed 1 million views. The world, which had been confused by the morning stock market collapse, suddenly had a face to put to the ruin. The hashtag the laughing predator began to trend globally, eclipsing the financial news. Ordinary people who had never heard of Langford Global Tech were now watching a billionaire assault a pregnant doctor in an ICU. The shift in the atmosphere on the street was palpable. Passers-by who had previously ignored the man in the expensive suit began to slow down, their eyes darting between their phone screens and his face. A group of commuters waiting for a bus turned as one, their expressions shifting from indifference to a cold, simmering disgust. Victor, sensing the change, tried to pull his collar up, but the anonymity he had once taken for granted was gone. He was no longer just a disgraced CEO. He was a monster caught in the act. The first domino Isabella had tipped had started the fall, but Lean Morales had just ensured there would be no ground left for him to land on. Under the flickering streetlights, the hunter had officially become the hunted. The humiliation on the street had been only a prelude to the true vacuum. As the viral video of the hospital assault effectively burned Victor's social and professional existence to the ground, the man himself had retreated to his final sanctuary, a glass-walled penthouse that pierced the city's skyline like a needle. Inside, the lights were dimmed, the only illumination coming from the persistent, accusatory flicker of a wall-mounted news feed. Victor sat in a velvet armchair, a half-empty glass of amber liquid in his hand, waiting for the legal team that wasn't answering his calls. The heavy, reinforced steel door to the penthouse didn't click or groan. It simply drifted open, as if the very security systems Victor had paid millions to install had decided to retire. A shadow detached itself from the hallway. Raphael, the writer who had carried Amara away from the rain, stepped into the living room. He didn't look like a hitman. He didn't even look angry. He looked like an inevitability. He wore the same dark leather jacket, the scent of motor oil and cold asphalt trailing behind him like a ghost. He moved with a terrifying, predatory silence that made the sprawling, 3,000-square-foot room feel like a cage. Victor scrambled to his feet, the glass slipping from his fingers and shattering on the Italian marble. "Who are you? How did you get past the lobby?" He stammered, his voice thin and reedy, stripped of the booming authority that had once terrified boardrooms. He reached toward the console on his desk, his fingers hovering over the panic button. Raphael didn't stop him. He didn't draw a weapon. He didn't even raise his voice. He simply reached into his pocket and pulled out a sleek, obsidian tablet, tossing it onto the desk in front of Victor. "Don't bother with the alarm," Raphael said, his voice a low, vibrating rumble that seemed to rattle the crystal chandelier overhead. "The security company was bought out 40 minutes ago. They aren't coming. Neither is your lawyer. Neither is the police." Victor looked down at the tablet. The screen didn't show the news or a ransom note. It showed a grid of 4 high-definition security feeds. For a moment, Victor didn't recognize what he was seeing. Then, the realization hit him like a physical blow to the chest. The cameras were inside his private offshore vaults in Zurich, the Cayman Islands, and the sub-basement of his own building. The heavy titanium doors were wide open. The shelves, once stacked with gold bullion, physical bonds, and hard currency reserves, were utterly, devastatingly empty. "What is this?" Victor whispered, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. "Where is it? Where is my money?" "It doesn't exist anymore," Raphael replied, stepping closer until he stood just inches from the man who had struck his sister. He didn't touch him, yet Victor shrank back as if he had been struck by a physical force. "Every cent you used to blackball doctors, buy off directors, and silence the people you stepped on has been redistributed. The digital footprint of your wealth was erased by the very systems you thought made you a god." Raphael leaned down, his eyes locking onto Victor's with a cold, terrifying intensity. "You told Amara she was just a girl playing God. But you forgot that a god is only as powerful as the faith of his followers. And right now, Victor, no one believes in you. Not even the machines." He reached out and tapped the screen, switching the feed. Now, the tablet showed a live view of the ICU at Riverdale Medical Center. It was quiet. The monitors were steady. The life Victor had tried to disrupt was still there, protected by people he couldn't buy. "You're not going to jail," Raphael said, his voice dropping to a whisper that felt like ice water down Victor's spine. "Jail is for people the system still cares about. You're going to stay right here in this glass box. You're going to watch the world forget you existed. You're going to be a ghost in your own home, with no name, no credit, and no way out." Without another word, Raphael turned and walked toward the door. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. As the door hissed shut, locking with a final, electronic definitive click, Victor Langford stood alone in the dark, staring at the empty vaults of a life built on nothing. The motorcycle's hum echoed from the street below, a fading heartbeat for a dead empire. The final click of the penthouse door was a death knell for one empire, but miles away, the shockwaves were just beginning to dismantle another. Inside the mahogany-lined office of the Riverdale Medical Center, Dr. Pierce sat behind his expansive desk, his hands clasped so tightly his knuckles had turned the color of bone. On the monitors lining his wall, the viral video of the ICU assault played on a relentless loop, a digital cancer eating away at the hospital's prestige. He had spent the morning trying to draft a statement that would distance the institution from Victor Langford, but the ink felt like lead. The quiet of his office was shattered not by a knock, but by the heavy, synchronized footfalls of state authorities. The door swung open to reveal a phalanx of investigators in windbreakers marked financial crimes, followed closely by uniformed officers. Pierce stood, his mouth opening to demand an explanation, but the lead investigator was already unfurling a warrant. "Dr. Arthur Pierce," the investigator asked, his voice cutting through the stale air. "You're under arrest for multiple counts of securities fraud, racketeering, and the systematic embezzlement of hospital endowment funds. We have the ledger, Doctor. Every off-the-books payment from Langford Global has been traced." The color drained from Pierce's face as the handcuffs ratcheted shut around his wrists. He looked toward his window, perhaps hoping to see Victor's motorcade arriving to save him, but he saw only the cold, indifferent glass of the city. He was being led through the very lobby he had policed with an iron fist, past nurses and orderlies who didn't look away this time. Their gazes were level, filled with the quiet satisfaction of seeing a tyrant fall. As Pierce was ushered into the back of a waiting cruiser, a black SUV pulled up to the hospital's main entrance. A woman stepped out, her blue gown replaced by a sharp, charcoal-gray suit that radiated a different kind of authority. Isabella Mendoza didn't look like a hacker now, she looked like a conqueror. She was flanked by a legal team carrying silver briefcases, their expressions as neutral as the law itself. In the hospital's crowded auditorium, the remaining board members sat in stunned silence as Isabella took the podium. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. She laid a single, notarized document on the lectern, the deed to the entire medical complex. Effective immediately, Isabella announced, her voice amplified and steady, "Riverdale Medical Center has been acquired in its entirety. The previous ownership has been dissolved due to insolvency and criminal forfeiture." A murmur rippled through the room. A board member stood, his voice shaking. "Acquired by whom? We weren't even notified of a bid." Isabella looked directly into the camera at the back of the room, as if speaking to someone watching from a far-off, quiet place. "The hospital is now under the stewardship of the Bennett Family Trust. It is a private endowment dedicated to the protection of its staff and the uncompromising care of its patients." The name hit the room like a physical weight. The Bennett name, once associated with a troublesome surgeon and her mysterious brother, was now the header on every paycheck and the seal on every door. The hierarchy had been inverted. The people Victor and Pierce had tried to erase now owned the very ground they stood on. High above the city, Cairo watched the live broadcast from a small, secure monitor, his hand resting on the grip of his motorcycle. Beside him, Amara stood by the window of their new safe house, the bruise on her cheek a fading shadow. She watched the screen as Isabella reclaimed her world, piece by piece. There were no cheers, no grand speeches. Just the silent, surgical precision of a family that had learned long ago that the only way to survive a monster was to own the cage. The fall of the director was complete, and for the first time in years, the air in the hospital was finally clean. The velvet-lined isolation of the penthouse had transformed from a sanctuary into a tomb within 48 hours. Without the digital pulses of his bank accounts to sustain the climate control and the lightning-fast internet, the air had grown stale and heavy. Victor Langford stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the city he once owned pulse with a life that no longer acknowledged his existence. His reflection was a ghost. Unshaven, his silk shirt stained with the sweat of a man who had discovered that even water becomes a luxury when the pipes are controlled by a company you can no longer pay. By the third morning, the hunger had become a physical weight, a dull ache that stripped away the last of his pride. Desperation, cold and sharp, drove him out of the glass box and into the streets. He walked for miles, his Italian loafers scuffing against the grit of the sidewalk, unnoticed by the thousands of commuters who had once parsed his every public word for market hints. He was invisible, a casualty of a war that had been won without a single shot being fired. His feet eventually led him, through some cruel magnetic pull of irony, back toward the sterile white facade of the Riverdale Medical Center. But this was not the grand entrance where he had once stepped out of armored SUVs. This was the side clinic, the community outreach wing that he had once tried to defund to pad the hospital's quarterly dividends. The line of people waiting for care snaked around the corner, a tapestry of the very people he had deemed redundant in his pursuit of profit. Victor stumbled toward the intake desk, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. His vision was beginning to blur at the edges, a symptom of either low blood sugar or the crushing weight of his new reality. He reached the counter and collapsed against the cool plastic, his hands trembling as he looked up at the intake nurse. "I need a bed," he wheezed, his voice a dry rasp. "I haven't eaten in days. I think my heart. I need a doctor." The nurse didn't look up from her tablet immediately. When she did, her eyes didn't widen with recognition or fear. They were filled with the weary, professional indifference one reserved for the truly broken. Before she could speak, a shadow fell over the desk, blocking out the harsh fluorescent light. Victor turned his head slowly. Raphael stood there, leaning against the doorframe of the triage room. He wasn't wearing the leather jacket today, just a simple dark shirt that highlighted the stillness of a man who finally had everything in its right place. He watched Victor for a long moment, his expression unreadable, before stepping forward. "The clinic is at capacity, Victor," Raphael said, his voice a low, steady hum that seemed to vibrate in Victor's very marrow. "We prioritize based on need. And right now, there are people in this line who have been waiting for years for the resources you tried to burn down." Victor reached out, his fingers catching the edge of Raphael's sleeve. "Please," he whimpered, the last of the Langford arrogance dissolving into a puddle of raw survival. "I'm sick. I have nothing left." Raphael leaned down, his face inches from Victor's, mirroring the intimacy of their last encounter in the penthouse. But this time, there was a dark flicker of a smile playing at the corners of his mouth, the last laugh that Victor had once thought belonged solely to him. "You want a bed?" Raphael whispered, the words sharp enough to cut. "I remember a man who walked into an ICU and thought he could buy the air. I remember a man who thought a $12 million check could fix the soul of a pregnant doctor after he tried to break her. Amara is upstairs right now, saving a life you didn't think was worth the cost of the electricity." Raphael stood up straight, his gaze sweeping over the shivering wreck of the man before him. "You're right, Victor. You do have nothing left. And that's exactly what we have available for you. You can wait in the hall like everyone else. Maybe, if you're lucky, the pregnant doctor will have a moment to see you after she's finished with the people who actually matter." As Raphael walked away, the automatic doors hissed shut, leaving Victor slumped against the intake desk. The hallway was long, bright, and filled with the echoes of a world that had moved on, leaving the king of tech to wait in the silence of his own making. The morning sun began to burn through the city's persistent coastal fog, casting long, golden fingers across the newly polished glass of the Riverdale Medical Center. The construction scaffolding had been cleared away, revealing a facade that no longer looked like a corporate fortress, but a place of genuine sanctuary. Inside, the air was crisp, stripped of the heavy scent of neglect and corruption that had characterized Dr. Pierce's tenure. A quiet energy hummed through the hallways. Not the frantic, terrified pace of the past, but the rhythmic efficiency of a team that finally felt valued. Amara Bennett stood in the center of the redesigned trauma unit, her white coat freshly pressed, her stethoscope draped around her neck like a silver torque of office. The bruise on her cheek had long since faded, leaving behind a face that was sharper, more resolute, and radiating a quiet authority that didn't need to shout to be heard. She was no longer just the Ice Queen surviving a shift, she was the chief surgeon, and the wing she now commanded bore the name of the foster parents who had once given a pair of broken children a chance at a real life. She walked toward the nurses' station, where Lean Morales was busy organizing the morning's triage charts. When Lean looked up, her smile was wide and unburdened. The viral video was a memory now, a catalyst for a change that had transformed the entire city's medical landscape. "The new mobile unit is ready for its first run, Chief," Lean said, her voice filled with a pride that matched Amara's own. "We have 3 surgeons and 4 nurses volunteered for the community outreach shift today." Amara nodded, her hand resting momentarily on her belly. The baby was due in a matter of weeks, a living symbol of the future they had fought to secure. "Good. Make sure the pediatric supplies are doubled. We aren't just treating symptoms anymore, Lean. We're building a legacy." She spent the next few hours moving from room to room, her presence a stabilizing force for patients and staff alike. She didn't check the financial tickers on the wall monitors, they had been replaced by educational feeds and serene landscapes. She didn't look for the name Langford on the brass donor plaques, they had been melted down and repurposed for surgical instruments. Victor was a shadow, a ghost of a failed era, and in the bright, clinical light of the new Bennett trauma wing, shadows simply couldn't survive. As the afternoon light began to shift toward a deep, bruised purple, Amara stepped out onto the executive balcony that overlooked the hospital's main entrance. Far below, the city moved with its usual indifference, a sea of yellow taxis and hurried pedestrians. But her eyes weren't on the crowd. They were fixed on the far corner of the intersection, where a single black motorcycle was parked beneath the shade of a budding oak tree. Cairo sat on the bike, his helmet resting on the fuel tank. From this distance, he was just another rider, a quiet man blending into the urban tapestry, invisible to the world that Isabella now helped manage from her glass offices. He didn't wave, and he didn't call. He simply sat there, a silent sentinel watching the house his sister had built. He had returned to the shadows, a predator whose work was done, content to be the ghost that ensured the light stayed on. Amara placed her hand against the glass of the balcony, a silent acknowledgement of the bond that had bridged 2 worlds to achieve this moment. She saw him kick the kickstand up, the low, familiar hum of the engine vibrating even all the way up here. With a fluid motion, he pulled on his helmet, the visor clicking shut with a definitive sound that signaled the end of their war. He merged into the flow of traffic, his silhouette disappearing into the darkening streets until he was gone. Amara took a slow, deep breath, turned her back on the city, and walked back into the hospital to save another life. The legacy was no longer a dream, it was the steady, beating heart of the city. Thank you for watching, kindly subscribe and turn on your notification for more interesting stories.